My name is Julie Womack. I'm the head of organizing at Red Wine and Blue. So, if you are brand new to us, if you have never been to a Red Wine and Blue event before, we are so thrilled to have you here. It's going to be fun. The chat's going to be moving quickly, so please jump in there. We want everybody to tell us where you're from. As we go, please ask your questions. With this many people, we are not going to be able to answer every question, but we are going to pull the main themes out and do some Q&A at the end. So, Red, White, and Blue is a national organization. We have over 650,000 members across the country and 830 local affiliated groups. We focus on empowering women to fight extremism in their communities, and obviously, we are pretty busy right now. So, Red, White, and Blue, we focus on what we call friend to friend organizing, which is just the power of you using your voice to influence your friends and family. You have a big circle of influence, probably more than you realize. And this is going to be so important in 2025. Almost every state in this country has local elections. New Jersey, Virginia, we see you, we know you're different. But almost everybody else, you have local elections, your school boards, your city councils, your county commissioners. And this is the best way for us to fight the chaos coming out of DC is to elect local leaders who will stand up for our rights and fight back. Here's another thing that's so important to understand is that these local races are often really close. They can be won by a handful of votes. I have a friend in my city running for school board for the second time. She lost by 41 votes the first time. I've heard of school board races that have been won and lost by even a one or two votes. So every person you talk to and turn out, you could actually flip a seat or you could be the difference in who wins and loses an election. And that is why we are so excited tonight to talk to Sarah because she is going to talk to us about how we utilize our relationships and our shared experiences to really connect with people to make an impact. We want to step back from those political debates and be more effective. We want to do things that actually work toward persuasion and connecting with others. Okay, so we're about friend to friend organizing. I've already mentioned these after parties, so hang on for those. We are going to take everything we learn and apply it in real life and make a difference across the country because we are up to almost 1,700 people. We can make a huge impact across the country if we all work together. So before we get to the after party, we want to get to the main event, the main party. And so we are going to bring up Sarah Stein Lubrano. And I have to read a little of her bio to you guys because it is amazing. She has a background in feminist mutual aid and other local organizing, as well as teaching in prisons. She holds a PhD from the University of Oxford and a master's degree from Cambridge. She's previously the head of content at the School of Life, where she wrote obituaries. And she regularly appears on public radio and a variety of podcasts. And we're here to talk about her first book, Don't Talk About Politics. And we're going to drop links to everything, Sarah, so you can follow her. But before we do that, welcome, Sarah. We're so glad to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here. I don't know why my camera has decided to unfocus. Not sure
Oh,
where it
no.
thinks I should be, but I'm here. I'm very here, and I'm so happy to be here. I'm really happy to be with fellow Americans thinking about this stuff. I live in London, so I'm visiting the States right now, and I'm obviously care really deeply about this, and I'm just so happy to get to talk about it with people who are on the ground.
Well, we're excited to have you here just in time to be on our time zone for this event. So it would have been a little rough for you in London trying to do this. But can you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you decided to write a book called Don't Talk About Politics?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up always knowing that the world was kind of inherently political because my grandfather is a Holocaust survivor, and it never was in my realm of imagination that the world wasn't intrinsically political. But um, for a long time, I worked in other fields, and then in 2016, obviously, like many of us, especially a lot of white women, if we're honest, I kind of had an awakening where I realized that the world was deeply screwed up in ways I had not understood. And also because I lived in London, I saw the Brexit result, and I believe this phenomenon that we're going through right now is incredibly global. So I left my very lovely day job at a place called the School of Life, and I went and got a PhD in political theory. And I spent 6 years doing this PhD. And a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today is my research from that PhD, which I then translated into this book. And I wanted to write a book that could help me understand how we got here, but also why some of the assumptions that I had had back when I was younger about how politics works just aren't accurate, and therefore other kinds of action are needed. I think a lot of people, including myself when I was young, thought, oh, it's kind of just about like taking in information and then voting, and that's what politics is. And I now believe something very different, and I think we all have to know some of what I research in order to do the best that we can right now.
Absolutely. So your book makes a bold claim that ideas and arguments alone don't really change people as much as we think they do. I know a lot of us just love to argue politics online,
Yep.
even in real life. So what does transform people?
Well, there are two things that I focus on in my book. I first spend a couple of chapters looking at the evidence for whether things like debate change people's mind. And there is no evidence that debate changes people's mind. Both the debates they have face to face with each other and also watching debates has zero effect, which is honestly shocking if you think about it, because we have a huge history of debate in our country. Newspapers are set up as though they are debates. Congress is set up for debates. We watch presidential debates, but if you do a statistical analysis of whether people have a important change in their beliefs after watching debates, both the undecided and decided voters do not change their mind in a statistically significant way. That's even true for the Biden debate, and Biden was obviously not necessarily doing well there. So in addition, we also have a lot of data as social scientists that just absorbing information from the internet doesn't change people's minds. And I go through this data and then I look at two things that do change people's minds, and they're both relevant to what you do, but one of them particularly. So one is our network of relationships. When people experience a change in their network of relationships, that can change their mind in very significant ways. In fact, one of the strongest shifts in American belief systems was about gay people, and it happened over the last 25-ish years. And it seems to have been almost entirely driven by people coming out to their friends. It's a huge shift in public opinion. One of the things you almost never see in social science, and it seems to have been almost entirely driven by people who already had strong relationships with someone, realizing that person was gay, or sometimes trans or whatever else. But certainly, a lot of it was for gay rights and gay marriage. Um, and the other thing that changes people's mind a lot is their own life experiences, which is a little bit harder to access and change on the ground, but you can do things there as well. You can experience what I call gateway actions in the book, where you help someone have an experience that leads them into another way of thinking.
Okay, so can you share some examples from your book? You kind of touched on a few, but I'd love to give some concrete examples for people to really grasp this concept.
Sure, the relational or the actions.
Both.
Okay, let's talk about relational first. So, one of the things I'm very interested in is how people overcome prejudice. And one of my favorite bits of research that I got to use in the book is from something called the social contact hypothesis, which actually began when sociologists began to look at what happened when the US military desegregated after World War II. So, as many of us will probably know, previously the US military had basically black units and white units, and then sometimes other racial groups. And then they desegregated, which is good. But also, sociologists began to measure whether serving in desegregated units changed people's racial prejudices. And the answer was yes, and by a big margin in an important way, but only in certain conditions. And those conditions are, I think, really important for us to think about now because they are conditions that are unfortunately not always present in our social world. But here are some of the conditions. People need to have shared goals. That seems to be really important. So interestingly, it might actually be quite important if you and a person who is somewhat prejudiced have your kids on the same soccer team. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge political goal. It's just about having some kind of shared goal. The differences between people that you want to overcome need to remain salient throughout the interaction. This is part of why online interactions are not that good for this, because you might have somebody's avatar, like a picture of their dog, but you need to actually be conscious, like, this person is a different race than me, this person is a minority in another way, this person is a Muslim, whatever. You need to see the differences as you do this third thing, which is part of social contact theory, which is develop long form relationships with people, where you get to know them over time, where you can basically become friends in some sense. That doesn't mean you agree on everything or you don't have conflict or you don't have awkwardness, but you begin to really know them as a person. And that seems to do a lot of the work of unraveling prejudice. And there are some other conditions, but I think these three are really great to think about right now. And in my book, I have a whole chapter on friendship, basically. It's a little bit like My Little Pony, the power of friendship. Um, but all backed by sociological data and evidence. And the point is that our friends at the end of the day are our windows into other aspects of reality that we can't see for ourselves sometimes. And they're really, really powerful. Our friends don't brainwash us, but one of the main things I noticed in the book is they're so powerful because they are, in doing the research for the book, that is, they're our source of trust. So, an interesting bit of data about social contact theory is that it's not just powerful if, let's say that, someone is overcoming prejudice against I don't know, gay people, right? It doesn't even matter that much whether it's their friend that's gay or their friend's friend. Even a friend's friend is really powerful because we trust our friends. And if they tell us, hey, that person's all right, that has a profound effect as well. And so I guess one thing to say here is, all of us are vectors for trust for other people who may not be as politically active as us, but who could become so. In fact, one of the most amazing things is that in some of the data, they look at whether people who disagree on political issues change each other's minds. They don't necessarily, but something that absolutely does happen, even when they continue to disagree, is they make each other more interested in politics. So imagine how powerful that is when you do agree on a lot of issues. A lot of your friends and your connections might not be as profoundly interested in politics right now as you are, but if they agree with you somewhat, you just being in their life and talking to them about why this matters and asking them to do stuff, we'll get to that, has a huge effect on how much they suddenly feel like politics is relevant and matters. And there's lots of sociological data for this. And then I can talk about actions a little bit also if you'd like.
Ask you one question
But
that following up. I'm just curious. So
yeah.
basically, what you're saying is, if I'm translating this properly, is that the relationships that you have or the friends that you make or even new people you meet, making those connections and being able, even if you don't 100% agree on everything, just
Mhm.
building that friendship and that relationship and even just sharing your experiences or your friends' experiences is really a way to make an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the some changes people's minds in the long term. We'll talk about deep canvassing, I think, in a little bit, but it's another example of how this works.
Okay.
Just talking about issues, really.
Now you can move on to the next subject and give
You
your
want to talk about action?
yes.
Yeah, so the other thing that seems to change people's minds a lot in the sociological data is the actions and the experiences that we have. And this is, it's very difficult to give you a preview of a very long book and all the research in it, but it's a tricky one because the mere fact that actions change our minds is a neutral fact. People can have things happen to them that make them more racist or more prejudiced or more extremist or less. And there are some unexpected effects of this. For example, people who are denied abortions actually become less in favor of choice overall, which is a sort of, I can explain to you why in some other session that happens to people psychologically, but it's not a neutral fact. However, one of my favorite bits of data in this section that I think really illustrates the power of what is possible in political organizing is something called the gateway getaway debate. And what it is that sociologists and people who measure this used to worry that people who do small political actions might use that as a getaway, where they then don't worry about the larger problems. So like they worried that people would recycle and then they would stop caring about the climate, or they would do something performative and then they would check out. And it can, of course, go both ways, but the other option, which they also measured for, is maybe it's a gateway. Maybe you do a small political action and then you realize that, oh, I did this small action and it made me feel good and I do actually care about this and maybe I should do another action and then another. That would be a gateway action. And overall, right now, the evidence suggests that gateway actions, that these actions serve more as gateways than getaways. It can go both ways, but on average, small political actions tend to lead to larger and larger political actions. And so, what this means for relational organizing and other forms of organizing is that one of the big things we can do is get people to do actions with us, even small actions. And the way I do this in my organizing work is actually really simple. It's just that rather than tell my friends, hey, you really need to care about this, which is kind of confrontational and may not always work, I usually just ask them for help. Because that's what you do with friends anyway, right? You just ask them for help. So instead of telling people, you need to care about this and you need to go do this, I tell them, hey, I'm doing this weekend. Do you want to come? I know you're really good at organizing stuff. Would you come organize with me? I know you're really good at cooking and catering. Can you help me pick out the food for this? You're really good at welcoming people and I need people to feel welcome. Will you come with me and do this? I just ask for help. And that's the gateway action that gets a lot of people involved. And I've been gateway actioned myself, by the way, and I'm so grateful. It's actually a really easy way to get into stuff.
I love that idea because it really is an easy thing with your friends or people who you maybe know. I have friends who want to be involved but don't know what to do, and just inviting them into one thing, help me put some signs out, or like you said, you're hosting an event, come help me get the food or be the greeter at the door, like those little things. So that's an amazing gateway to do that. Gateway, I love.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so you also challenge the traditional notion of what it means to be a good citizen. How should we rethink that definition?
Well, I people who grew up even vaguely in the same kind of American context that I did might be familiar with the world of policy wonks or people who think about themselves as sensible and thoughtful and reasonable because they read a lot and they have a lot of information in their heads and they know a lot and they argue with people. And I'm not saying those things are bad. It's very important to be informed. It's good to consider other points of view that you haven't heard before. All of that is good. But based on the data and evidence in my book, and based also on the moment that we are in history, I think it's far more important to emphasize action, especially because if our actions and our relationships are the things that allow us to think more deeply about politics and understand it better, then the good citizen isn't somebody who just is highly informed and engages in critical thinking in the abstract. They're a person who does stuff. One of the things I read about in the book is the level of involvement in social movements and how people who are more involved are changed for life. People who are involved in protest movements, for example, are actually the only people that are changed in the long term by demonstrations. So there's not any evidence, shockingly, in a way, that demonstration-led protests, so by that I mean just going on the street and having signs and yelling, that does not change the government's mind. We do not have any evidence that that has changed the government's mind over the last 50 years. I know this is a bit of a blow sometimes because a lot of us have done a lot of this. It also does not seem to change the public's mind in the long term. Even very recent big movements like Black Lives Matter, we've seen people's opinion on things like that go back to the baseline from before that movement's beginning. However, there is one group of people whose minds are changed for good. That's the protesters. The protesters are changed for life. Um, and 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 I think that's actually a beautiful thing. People who are involved in long-term struggle and protest and thinking become better citizens precisely because they're involved day to day, they're active. Another image I think about a lot in the book is the people preparing for the Million Man March in DC and the way that there was a whole group of people who, as you may guess, were mostly women who simply planned the sandwiches for the event. They planned it down to the level of the sandwiches. They were that involved. And they decided no mayonnaise because it's going to go bad in the heat and everyone will get food poisoning. Um, and I think about those women making the sandwiches and I say, that's what it means to be a good citizen. It's about the doing. You will also have lots of interesting thoughts and intellectual conversations at some point, but it's not about what's here so much as it's about what you're doing and who you're meeting. And that's the good citizen.
Okay, so we're talking about changing people's minds, and I love what you're saying about it. It is that building on your relationships, sharing those stories, getting people to into that gateway, having them doing some kind of small action. I think we were going to kind of challenge the people in the chat. You want to go ahead and do that about changing your minds?
Yeah, so something I think about a lot is uh when I teach people who are organizing, or teach is the wrong word because I actually feel when I run workshops I learn as much from the people in the room. But when I run things, I notice people have an impulse to argue with each other or argue especially with people in their lives. And I totally understand. I think we've all been there where we thought I need to tell my boss how wrong they are. I need to tell my horrible uncle how wrong he is. Um, but then I ask people to reflect on something else, which is, what is the last time that you changed your mind about something very significant? And most of the time, people come back to me and they tell me a story that is a lot more complicated than just reading something in the newspaper or noticing a fact. So, what I'd like to do for a minute is just ask you to think, just for 30 seconds or a minute, think about the last time you changed your mind on an issue and think about what might have been part of that decision-making process or that shift of belief. Who was involved in it? Who else in your life was involved in it? What were you doing at the time? And if you want to, you can also write something in the chat because it's nice to hear other people's stories. Obviously, you don't have to, but if you want to, it's nice to see other people's thoughts. And I was actually thinking about an example today from a long time ago, so I'll tell you my example while people are thinking. Um, but when I was an undergrad, I began to look for opportunities to volunteer. And I ended up volunteering in a program where we taught in prisons. And I really just thought about it at the time as sort of do-gooding. Um, and then I went to start teaching in prisons. And the very first day, I realized that some of the women, we were only allowed to teach women if we were women, some of the women couldn't read, basically. And I think that's when I became radicalized in a sense. I became much less convinced that the system as it currently functions is acceptable. Um, and the more that I built a relationship with the women there, the more I could see all the ways the system had let them down. So, yeah, this is just an example. Obviously, you'll have lots of your own, and I'm very curious to see some of them.
Yeah, I'd love to see in the chat for all of you because I obviously knew about this ahead of time because we wrote the questions.
Yeah.
Um, but I had to think for a minute because I was like, I don't know. Like, it is hard to change your mind. And I think the only thing I could think of was some discussions with my son around politics and then getting his perspective. But I have a relationship. And as you were speaking, I actually thought of an old story from when I was back in school. My husband is of a different race, and we had a classmate who had a sister who was dating biracially, and he was very opposed to it. But then once he got to know my husband and I, he completely changed his mind because he had that personal experience. So I'd love to see in the chat if anybody does have things that they've changed their mind about, but we'll kind of like check on that as we go. It is kind of hard to do that. You've already talked about the social contact theory. How does the idea of relationship driven change align with what grassroots groups or community organizers or people like Red, Wine, and Blue are already doing? You heard me mention, friend to friend organizing at the top. So how do everything you're discussing really align with what these groups are doing?
Well, and I want to say this while also addressing something I'm seeing popping up in the comments. So people are saying, no, but protest is really important. And I'm not telling you the protest doesn't work. I'm actually saying something slightly more complicated, which is important. What I'm saying is that protest does not work for changing the minds of people outside the movement. However, it works really well in some cases as a recruitment tool. It works really well to bring people in. So if you imagine people protesting Trump, those people are being changed, and the more they bring their friends with them, the more the protest is working. It's just that they're not changing people who don't already agree with them or at least aren't on the fence and could be brought into the movement, and they're not changing the government's mind, which in this case we know because the idea that Trump cares about these protests is sadly far from any of our imaginations. So protests work, but they work in terms of recruitment and also in terms of retention. They keep people energized. That's what protest is for, and that's what we need to use it for. So to get back to your point, Julie, what we learn from all of this research is that when we are involved in political movements, one of the number one things that we are doing is building relationships with other people and bringing them in and keeping them motivated and taking care of each other. The jargony word for this is social reproduction. But what it means really is that we're taking care of each other. We're helping each other, go home at the end of the day and keep some of the energy that we need to go out and do this again. We're reproducing ourselves. Um, and that means lots of things. It also means teaching each other, sharing skills, sharing resources that we have, keeping each other motivated. That's what protests do, but that's what a lot of things do. And that's also why relational organizing works, because that's part of what human beings can do for each other. So it's about that relationship building and seeing ourselves not as abstract, good critical thinkers, as nice as critical thinking is, but rather as people who are nexuses for relationships and for bringing people into important struggles.
Can you tell us the difference between, okay, so we've talked a little bit about friend to friend, relational organizing, having these conversations, building on the relationships you already have, finding little ways to get people involved, sharing your stories. Um, can you tell the difference to me and to everybody here, the difference between deep canvassing as opposed to traditional tactics that most campaigns do? Because I think it really touches on what we're trying to do to influence people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done mostly actually the less effective kind of canvassing, but I know about both. So in traditional canvassing, the thing that has been most commonly done by especially political parties, what you do is you tend to go door to door in your neighborhood and you knock on the door with someone who's probably roughly a stranger and you say, "Hey, are you voting for so and so?" And then they tell you if they answer the door at all. And then usually they're either in your party and they are voting for your candidate, and you say, "Great, do you want to ride to the polls on the day?" Or maybe they're on the fence and then you might have a conversation with them for a little bit, or they're like, absolutely not, leave me alone, right? And then you collect data for the party or the organization that you're working with. And that's, for lack of a better word, shallow canvassing. It's normal canvassing. And Obama's campaign used this fairly effectively, but what it does, again, I'm saying something very specific, not it doesn't work, but it does something very specific according to all of the best data that we've gathered. It basically helps make sure that people who are on your side get to the polls. So you can track people that need a ride and you can take them. It does not appear to be effective at moving people on the dial in terms of who they're going to vote. Probably because, honestly, if some stranger rocks up at your door who you don't know and they tell you a bunch of reasons they think you should do something, I don't know how much swearing is allowed on these calls, but you're going to
Go
tell them
ahead.
to go, you're not that interested. And so there are moments where that canvassing can be useful. If you really are on a like hairline election and you want to get people out the door, that's potentially a tactic that you may want to use. But we are facing a very long-term challenge in this country that requires many other tactics and other strategic plans. And we need to do some long-term belief change, especially where we can most affect a change. And relational organizing is one aspect of that, but deep canvassing is a specific tactic related to relational organizing because it involves the building of relationships over time in some ways, and it also just involves different kinds of conversational patterns. So deep canvassing is a technique that was developed in large part, interestingly, off the back of research on addiction. I won't get into that here because we'll end up having a very interesting conversation that isn't as immediately relevant, but you can look it up or you can read my book and I talk about it. And this is how deep canvassing works. Someone comes to the door of the person and they knock on the door and they ask the person, "Hey, on a scale of 0 to 10, where are you on this issue?" Which is actually very important that they don't say, "Do you agree or not?" They say, "Where are you 0 to 10?" Because most human beings will not say 0 or 10. There are, of course, occasional people that are like that, but most people will say, even if they're feeling very strongly about it, 1 or 9. Because to be honest, most of us are a 1 or a 9, and I actually find that promising in a way. Most of us are 1 or 9, or 2 or 8, or a lot of people, honestly, maybe not the people in this call, but a lot of people in the world are like a 5 or a 4 or a, so they tell you the number. And then if you are the deep canvasser, you do not say, "Why aren't you at a 10?" Like this is so important. You don't say that, assuming you want them to be at 10 on the issue. You say, "Oh, why aren't you at 0?" Because then the person begins to say with their own words, their own reasons why they might agree with you in some way. And the truth is that all persuasion is self-persuasion, according to psychologists. Most of the time, we're not listening and thinking, Julie made some really good points. I'm going to be with Julie. This is specific to politics, by the way. Julie can probably convince me about the best restaurant, but she may not be able to convince me about my most deeply held beliefs. So you're helping the person articulate their own reasons why they might actually think differently. And as they hear themselves say their own reasons, they're much more likely to come around to a different point of view. That happens, and then you listen deeply with as little judgment as possible. This is why deep canvassing requires training to some degree. It's hard, especially when people say things that are, offensive, for lack of a better word, or painful or difficult. And then the person shares their own life experience with that issue. A lot of the time right now, deep canvassing is used by progressive groups to talk about things like immigration or gay rights or trans rights, and the person has a direct experience with that, whatever the most direct experience is. So they say, "Well, actually, I was an immigrant," or "Actually, I know a lot of people that have migrated here," or "I'm trans," or whatever it is. And then they share their own story for why that thing matters. This is called narrative exchange in the literature. And that appears to be one of the most important aspects. It's non-judgmental exchange of stories with a person who has already expressed some ambivalence. And then you listen, and then they get to say whatever they want to say, and then you ask them again where they are on the issue, which is also important because then they usually shift a bit. And interestingly, they shift a lot more than in a lot of other canvassing tactics. And the reason you ask them is so that they notice that they've shifted their views. And when all of the data is put together on deep canvassing, people move a lot more on the dial than they do on other issues, and that seems to stick. Um, so I really am fascinated by deep canvassing, and I think there are moments we're going to need it in this country. I do want to say that it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of training, so it's not that it's always going to be the best tactic. But the reason that I'm talking you all through it on this call is that all of you are interested, it seems, in some form of relational organizing, and all of the tactics that I just mentioned within that larger tactic, the 0 to 10, the asking them the reasons why they're not 100% against it, the listening deeply and non-judgmentally, the narrative exchange, the asking again, "Oh, where are you now on this?" Those are probably important in the relationships we build as well in relational organizing. And they are things that I've used a lot now in my life because I am very interested in that pull that we slowly have on our friends over time in the course of the social world.
Well, can we talk
And
about
yeah, by the way, there are institutes that train in this. I think one is literally called the Deep Canvassing Institute, but I believe there are some others. Often they are issue focused, but not always. So
for sure? And I think everybody could go do research on their own if they're really fascinated in learning the techniques.
yeah,
But what I'd like to do is take the concepts you just talked about because we've already talked about
absolutely.
we're talking about talking to friends and family, people we know, people who are in our circle of influence. So we already have a relationship with them. So how do we take some of those, you know, we're not all going to be trained, we're not all going to be perfect, but how do
No,
we take those techniques that you just talked about, like, to make them kind of persuade themselves? Like, how do we approach those conversations with friends and people we already have in our life?
I mean, really, I would do almost all the steps I just mentioned in an informal way, even though it's hard. And one of the things people say to me a lot when I when I talk to people about this stuff is they say it sounds hard. And I'm going to say this before I get into the details. It is hard. But you know what? It's hard good. Like it's that hard feeling after you go on a run and then you think, "Oh, I really didn't want to go on a run, but now I feel good." Or it's the hard good of when your kid tells you something and you have a good conversation about how, it's the hard good feeling. So it is hard and it will feel scary and you might be an introvert and think, "Oh my gosh, I do not want to do this," but it's hard good, I promise. And even if the first one doesn't go great, down the road, it's a skill that you will develop and you'll get there. This is my pep talk and I give it to myself. Um, So again, here are some of the things that you might do. Firstly, you ask them in an open-ended, non-judgmental way, where are you on this issue? What do you think? And you don't even have to make it the big, big question. You can start with something like, oh, did you see this thing in the news? What do you think about that? Right? Nice open-ended question. And then again, you're asking them a question about why they're not 100% in favor of, say, whatever the Trump thing is, right? So they might say, well, I think this, but I also think this. You go, oh, interesting that you think, that it is a little bit troubling. Tell me more. What do you mean? Right? You're just listening. It's open-ended listening. And then you tell them your closest relationship to that issue and some experiences you've had around it. That appears to be very important, partially because it's not your beliefs necessarily that you're sharing with them right away, even though they might know your beliefs pretty well. It's your experience. It's your experience of my friends have been fired, or, this has been banned from my kid's school. Because it's apparently pretty unusual, not completely impossible, sadly, but pretty unusual that people tell you that didn't happen. They are now taking in a piece of information through you. You are the vector of trust. And then you listen, you tell them your experience, you listen non-judgmentally, and then you ask them where they're at again by the end of the conversation at some point. And again, this is hard work. Something else I find helpful sometimes is it's quite good to do this, especially with men, when you're not looking straight at their face. Like a lot of people find these conversations easier when they're side by side because it's a little bit less confrontational. And you can be doing something. Doing something is great for this. We're going on a drive. By the way, did you see that thing in the news? Works great. We're going to go fishing. We're going to go on a walk. We're going to go, I don't know, take our kids to the park. And by the way, did you see that thing in the news? This is the technique. I use it a lot. There are people who can train better in this because they haven't spent a lot of time doing a PhD instead. But these are the rough moves. And I find them helpful and it helps me be a little bit less anxious about it as well.
No, no, I love this. I think all these like things you can do, especially when we're talking like this year's local elections, right? So a lot of people don't even know anything about on the ballot. It's not controversial. We're not electing the president. So you can have, you can start setting the table. You can start building power for next year by having these discussions about issues and establishing yourself as the person who's kind of in the know about politics, right? To someone that you can come back to. So the other thing you talk about in your book that I do want to touch on is that the social infrastructure has kind of broken down, like the places where we form relationships, such as parks and community centers, playgrounds, that it's eroding. So, what are the biggest changes that you have noticed?
Well, it's not just me. There are huge research piles on this, but let me go back for a minute and tell you what social infrastructure is. Social infrastructure is the places that we can gather cheaply or without much effort or even for free, where we encounter other people in a very specific way. Sometimes people call these third spaces, and I'm just going to tell you why they're called third spaces because it will make clear what I'm talking about. The first space is the home, and the home is private. Most people cannot go in your home, right? The second space is work. Work is interesting, and actually, some interesting political things happen at work. Everything from unionizing to some of the stuff we talked about earlier with people overcoming prejudice. But it also has hierarchies. There are things you can't do at work because of professionalism, so there are limitations on some of its political functions, let's say. But third spaces are neither home nor work, and because they're mostly not hierarchical and mostly anyone can go there, they appear to have a big political influence. And third spaces are things like the bowling alley and church in some cases, or other religious institutions, or the park. Or here's my favorite example that I talk about a lot that's incredibly relevant to probably a lot of people on this call. If you go and drop your kids off at school, and in the process, you get out of your car and you take your kids, and then you stand on the playground and you wait for the bell to ring, and then the kids go in. Or if you go to pick them up and you do this in reverse, so you park your car and you get out of the car and you stand on the playground, or maybe you walk there, whatever, and you're standing on the playground and you're waiting for the kids, and you meet the other parents and you're talking to the other parents. That is a beautiful piece of social infrastructure by accident almost, right? You're all waiting around and your kids are probably like taking forever to tie their shoes or they're chasing each other. And now is the perfect time where you're going to meet someone that you didn't know before who you have something in common with. You have a shared goal, which is you both want your kids to have a good time at school, but you don't necessarily have a lot of other things in common. That's a social infrastructure. Beautiful. In America and also in other countries, by the way, over the last 50 to 70 years, we are seeing the shrinking of social infrastructure and the privatization of social infrastructure. So more and more public spaces are now owned by companies who keep them private. Things are being defunded. I mean, every national park is a piece of social infrastructure, right? Things are being closed down by the government. People are more and more driving as well in some areas. So now parents are driving and then they park their car in a line and they sit there on their phone in their car and they never talk to another parent. This is terrible for the school, right? But it's also terrible for the nation. Um, And so one of the things I talk about a lot in my book and argue for and think is really important, including and especially when it comes to the possibility for us to even relationally organize, is to rebuild these places of social infrastructure and to make them affordable and inclusive, which is not as easy as it sounds. Um, and one of the things I tend to tell people is, it's tempting to go and build a new social infrastructure, and that might be the right move. But a lot of the time, if you do that, what will happen is mostly your friends will come. And one of the even better things we can do if we have any resources, whether that's our time or our attention or our money or some combination, is to go find a social infrastructure that is on the edge of shutting down or is having other problems and reinforce it and like buffer it up because that's going to be the place where people can meet and talk about the issues and be heard. So, maybe your local library is in trouble. Maybe your local park is in trouble. Maybe your kid's school needs a place where kids can play after school for a while that didn't have before. This is also important. It's also a part of this relational stuff. And I'm very worried about it for America. I'm actually very worried about it for the world. But it requires resources, whether that's advocacy or money or both.
Okay. And obviously this breakdown of, like you said, like it does hurt democracy, right? Not having these shared spaces, not having places where we connect. Okay. So I know we're getting close to the where I want to do Q&A. So if anybody has questions, I know there have been questions in the chat, and I know Julie, my coworker Julie, is collecting notes. We're going to bring her up here. But for folks who are inspired by everything that you're saying, who are thinking to themselves, okay, I have long these relationships, I can talk about my shared experiences, I can talk to them about issues and where they feel, we can bring up stories on the news, we can invite people to do things with us, those small steps, those gateways to like getting involved. What would you suggest someone who's like, okay, I'm ready, I'm going to do some of this week? What could they do to start building those kinds of relationships that you write about, or just taking those first steps to really trying to use your techniques?
I mean, number one thing is go ask a bunch of your friends to help you with whatever the next thing you're gonna do is. If it's a protest, great, then use it as a recruitment tool because that's what protests are good for, and ask some friends to come that you haven't asked before. And you know what? Worst case, if they're not on board, they will come up with some silly excuse, but at least you have tried. And hopefully they will come with you and it'll be amazing. Um, Maybe also try to identify a piece of social infrastructure in your neighborhood and then see what resources it needs. And I bet that if you ask somebody who, for example, works at a school near you or a library near you what that place needs, they will know. The librarians, by the way, librarians, some of the most amazing people in America, they will know. They will tell you what it needs. Um, so I would say I would start with those two things. I try not to say too many things in a row because then it feels overwhelming, but those two things are really good things, you know? Yeah. And then just stay in contact with people. It might not seem like it's working at first, but I have a friend who one day just plopped down on my couch after a year of us disagreeing and said, "You know what? Actually, I think this now." And she had come around. And so also just keep checking in and building those relationships. I'm going to be honest because this is a group of women. Traditionally, women have done this work. And this is some of the first generations of women that are also allowed to do this work in an explicitly political way. But not that men never do this, but women hold relationships together more, and we should now be doing that to protect our rights. So if we're going to do social relational work, let's keep checking in on all those relationships that women have always been asked to hold together, the friendships, the in-laws, all the logistical, mental load stuff that we're doing to keep relationships together, but let's do it in a way that actually protects us from the bad stuff happening in this world, basically.
Absolutely. And yeah, now we have some skills and techniques and things to think through as we are having these conversations and talking to people in our life. Okay, well, I am going to drop in the chat where people can follow you. Is there any place that you do more work, anything you want where people, I know you,
Honestly, the number one thing right now is Instagram. I make content. I make a reel almost every day. Um, I also have a Substack, and I have, most of the things. I don't really use Twitter anymore because it's evil, but I have Blue Sky and TikTok and yes, Substack, and I'd love to have people come and read what I write about and think with me. But yeah, number one place I am is Instagram, and I try to make it fun as well. It's not all dark and depressing, which is hard to do in this world. So
all right. Well, what we're going to do now is I know there have been questions in the chat, so we're going to bring up Julie, and she is going to pull some of the main themes, some of the big questions from the chat, and have Sarah answer those. And then please, once I'll come back up. We're going to finish up, and then please stay on because we're going to do the after parties. Come on, we've got so many people on this call. We can make a huge difference in these local elections. So I'm going to drop off and let Julie and Sarah carry this on.
So, a couple things that really stuck out is that people are really agonizing over relationships with their family members. and wondering what to do because there's been a lot of division in families with all of this going on, with both the first term and now this term as well. So, what is your recommendation to them?
Great. I mean, there are two things, and I'm saying them simultaneously. They might sound like they're contradictory, but they're not. They're just about calibrating, I would say. So the first thing is there's a lovely tool that was created for organizers called the Spectrum of Allies. And the Spectrum of Allies kind of marks how much people are already in support of the things you care about. So if, let's say that the issue is climate change for organizers, and just as an example, there are people who are already hardcore on board, and this is like a big issue for them. Then there are people that are passive supporters. They're not doing a lot about the climate, but they do care. And then there are people that are kind of, on the fence. Maybe they believe in climate change, but they're not really sure if anything should be done about it because other issues matter more to them, whatever. And then, of course, we have our opponents, right? And sometimes people overly focus on particular family members because they have these deep emotional relationships with them that are actually on a part of the spectrum of allies that it's not necessarily helpful to work as hard on. So if you have somebody that you love, but they are, I don't know, a climate change denier or something like this, what I would honestly say is while you should keep like sharing your experiences with them in the hope that maybe they come around, that's going to be a hard sell. And that might not be the most important family member for you to work with. It's probably much more likely that what you can actually make big progress with is those people that are either passive supporters, mobilizing them into a movement, bringing them to a protest, getting them to open the social infrastructure with you, whatever it is, or people that are on the fence but could be brought along on the path. Um, and then the second thing that I would say is, um, you know, I guess I do believe that the more that we practice this set of skills, the easier it gets. That doesn't ever make it easy. It is painful. And look, honestly, as a left-wing Jewish person, I promise you it has not been easy the last year or two. Um, but I do believe that we can tell people that we disagree with them with love, and we can mostly hold those relationships even through that disagreement. And the best thing we can do is keep practicing, And the good news is there's lots of other things in those relationships, ideally. So if the person, let's say, is on the fence, but sometimes they disagree with you and it's worth working on that relationship in a political way, then you focus on the good things also and you tell them what you appreciate about them and then you practice these skills we talked about earlier. And you do both. And eventually that will become more like second nature and you'll say, this is how I manage my relationships. But that's what I would say. I'm not saying it's easy, by the way. I never tell people nonsense. It's sometimes it's hard. But if it's worth it for the right relationships and the right people, that's what I would do.
And then there was some discussion in the chat about, and you brought it up too, about protesting. And specifically, someone brought up the civil rights movement. And I literally had this conversation earlier today that a lot of folks actually focus on the fact that there were a lot of different protests, but the protests were a tool. They didn't actually do the work or make the movement because there were lots of other things that happened with legal challenges and getting in rooms where folks weren't normally in rooms before to change minds, and that's what really moved the needle and made things happen. The demonstrations were helpful because it got folks who might not know things were going on or even understand that that was happening, but it wasn't what actually changed people, I would
Hmm.
argue. And like I said, before I even had talked with you or met you this evening, I had this conversation earlier today. You are not negating the fact that those protests were valid and they happened and but they were a tool to get other things done.
Yeah, I think the civil rights movement is a great example because the protests mattered, but they again mattered for very specific ends, right? Firstly, they kept people involved. And I want to say from the beginning, by the way, that the civil rights movement was very unpopular in its own time. If you look at the approval ratings, they were not high. Many people thought they were bad, harmful for the rights of the, black person, etc. You can go look up that data. It's fascinating. What was effective about those protests in the long run was they kept people energized. They brought some people into the movement. And also, those were what I would call, high commitment movements. They asked, honestly, a lot more from their participants than most social movements do today. And in fact, we arguably don't have strong social movements in the way that we used to. And I also want to point out that they use social infrastructure really well. I talk about this in my book. And to this day, by the way, lots of struggles for racial justice, especially among Black Americans, do this, I would say, better than others. So there are still pieces of social infrastructure like the Black barber shop or the Black church, most famously, but other ones as well, that are a space where people gather informally all the time in ways that are not always political, but where political things happen, right? Black churches have long been a place for political organizing. Also, black mosques. The Black Barbershop has long been a place for political organizing. And I think some of the most famous Black Panthers even got radicalized in these places, which were filled with literature and where the barbers would say, "Hey, what do you think about this?"
Mhm.
As they were cutting your hair. So I guess the point is we think about the civil rights movement as these protests sometimes. The common conception of the American public has is, wow, these protests, and then everyone looked at the protests and changed their mind. But that's not what happened. What happened was a ton of relational organizing and a lot of social infrastructure building and a very slow, long process of belief change alongside, as you mentioned, of course, these legal struggles and other things.
Yeah, I mean, Charles Hamilton Houston is an amazing man. If you don't know who he is, go read about him. Um, so somebody asked about strikes. How
Hmm.
effective are strikes?
They can be really effective. I mean, this is a big question because what you're asking about in a way is is about whether they work as either a tactic or a strategy. These are like four terms that me and my partner in crime and movement training do a lot. So there's tactics, then there's strategy, then there's your theory of change, how you think the world changes, and then there's your ethos, like the things you believe in. And anyway, strikes are kind of either a tactic or a strategy. And not all strikes work because you need a kind of enough of a lever of power or the way I often tell people, to be completely honest, is you need to take something, I'm sorry for using this word, but you need to take something hostage that the people in power want and not give it back until you get what you want. So if you're lucky and you strike well and you have the right momentum behind you and the right stuff that you've taken control of, then you can move the lever of power because the people in power need the thing you have. If you have
Mhm.
enough people on board for the strike, they're going to have to negotiate with you because they need the factory, or in this case, I don't know, the Deliveroo drivers to go back to work, right? Um, in that case, it can be quite effective, way more effective than a lot of demonstrations on their own. But it's just a question of whether you've got enough stuff behind you. And yeah, I really like reading Jane McAlevey, who's sadly passed away now, but she has a lot of good writings on how to organize people for strikes. A lot of good, I think she has some video content as well. So if you're interested in doing strikes, I mean, that's a good place to start. There are many other good places to learn about strikes as a tactic.
Well, and I love that you talk about relational organizing, and someone in the chat asked, what can a disabled person do? And relational organizing would be perfect, talking with friends and family. Do you agree?
I do, although I think I want to say, because I talk to disabled people a lot as part of my writing for my next book. And I think this is one of the areas where it's really tricky because a lot of things I ask people to do or that I even just show evidence for require a lot of meeting up. And obviously we've just lived through a massive pandemic. And I want to just say out of respect for the people I interview and talk to about this, that a lot of disabled people feel like the social world has abandoned them, and that people have thrown them under the bus and that it's actually much harder for them to do a lot of the things that are now called for. But to address that, I also think, of course, there is a lot of room for power there as well. It just requires some shifts, both in the way that disabled and non-disabled, in quotes, people think about it. I say non-disabled because we're all going to be disabled in our lifetime, probably in various ways. But yes, I think there's a lot of forms of relational organizing that disabled people can do, and sometimes they are even better at it because they've had to advocate for themselves for a long time. Obviously, like phone stuff is particularly valuable in some cases. Um, yes, there's stuff to do there. There's definitely stuff to do there. And I think the other thing that I see very effectively is, unlike a lot of other online spaces, I find the disability community online spaces to be pretty political in a way that's really inspiring.
So, why does the Republican Party seem so much better at getting their messages across?
Well,
Um,
firstly, I think they know a lot of the stuff that's in my book. And actually, at the end of my book, and this is really bleak, but I look at an interview between Steve Bannon and David Brooks from the New York Times. And Steve Bannon kind of says the same stuff that's in my book, but obviously from a much more dark and horrible political position. He says,
Mhm.
I organized people. I got them online. I gave them a task to do every day, so they felt deeply invested in the movement. And then I got them offline to run as local people in their neighborhoods for positions in the local government. And they feel really happy because they are now in relation with other people. They have new relationships. They were lonely before and they have stuff to do. And I feel very weird telling you this because because it's horrible to see that your enemies have these insights, but they do. And a lot of people think about the right as people that are just sort of like terminally online, horrible dudes. And look, those dudes have come for me online before, so I know who they are. But actually, there are a lot of right-wing people that are very good at doing this kind of organizing. Maybe they learned it in certain kinds of churches or other groups. Maybe it's more built into some of the cultures that they come from, but they have this insight and they are getting people to mobilize offline, build relationships offline, do stuff offline. And we can't always play the same game they're playing, and nor should we, but we can access these insights and do the same thing. And as a last thought, or one of the last thoughts, it does make you happier. There's a lot of research on this, and I always say this because I want people to feel motivated. Around the world, there's happiness research that looks at a lot of different variables. It looks at people's stated levels of happiness, their level of mental health, all kinds of other things, metrics of happiness. And on average, left-wing people, even when you control for all these other variables, seem more unhappy than right-wing people unless they are doing activism. And then they're happier again. And the reason that that is true is very likely a combination of the relationships you build when you do political activism and the fact that seeing that the world is in trouble and not doing anything about it is a big source of unhappiness, and seeing that the world is in trouble and knowing you are doing something about it is is incredibly meaningful and restores a lot of happiness to people.
That's really incredible.
Mhm.
And something really to think about. Um, One last question. Somebody asked about engaging Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and I'm doing a lot of study on Gen Z myself right now. So, what are your thoughts?
I am very worried about Gen Z. I am giving a talk to a bunch of Gen Z people on